Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the El Delfin Yellow Honey Processed Costa Rica from Blossom Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Blossom, based out of Manchester, England. And they were a suggestion to us by Circle Pour, aka Niall. So shout out to and thank you to Niall for the suggestion. This is Blossom's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. I also wanted to give a shout out to and thank you to my good buddy Zach, as he sent us the 2 bags of Blossom coffee that we will be reviewing. And when he did pick these up from a coffee shop, these were the only 2 Blossom coffees that they were offering, which made it very easy to decide on which coffees we were going to be reviewing, beginning here today with this Costa Rican, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee was definitely in line with a lot of my previous experiences with English coffees, which is to say that it was on the more developed side of what we typically review on this channel. I feel like most people would closely align this with maybe a lighter side of a medium, or some people might say that this is a much more developed side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 18, first impression, and that's the very first thing I noted with this coffee was that roast profile had been in line with my expectations and previous experiences with a lot of English coffees, as there was a slight smokiness present right from the start. In addition to that, there was an initial chocolate component, but there were also some subtle components, including a floral honey as well as a citric brightness to the cup. Overall, it was an okay first impression, not necessarily the best, but we continue on to day 20 as I ran it through the Chemex, and it was already a fair bit better, as there was noticeably less of the smokiness through this brew method, but rather a little bit more of a fruit forward component, skewing a little bit in the citric direction with a slight bit of this stone fruit apricot aspect to the cup as well. Moderately bright, much better second impression. We continue on to day 22. As I ran it through the April brewer, and the slight smokiness was present yet again through this brew method, much more so within the cool down itself, as the early days have yielded a fair bit of consistency with a chocolate forward base, a subtle honey, a citric characteristic, and on this day a slight vegetal quality to the cup as well. Not necessarily my favorite through this brew method, but we continue on to day 25, and first adjustment I made the decrease in temperatures. And I've often said that a lot of the reason I start at 96 degrees Celsius for these coffees is because it makes it very easy to adjust from that point. You can usually tell if maybe you should go a little cooler, maybe you should go a little hotter, but on this case, I decided that a decrease in the temperatures would really help this cup, and it certainly did. And it was a very minor adjustment, but even then, it allowed a lot of the components within this cup to shine a fair bit more, as less of that smokiness allowed the other components to be a little bit more at the forefront of this one, including an early floral honey component that we'd experienced from those previous days, much more present on this day with a soft chocolate characteristic and nearly none of the earlier smoky characteristics. Slight bit more of the citric aspect as well as a moderate stone fruit yet again. Best day so far, as this one was brewed through the Chemex. Day 27, same adjustments through the V60, and at this time I decided I had a slight preference towards the Chemex because there was a little bit more vibrancy, a little bit more clarity through the Chemex. But on this day, there was a little bit more of that citric aspect, as previously mentioned on other days. Less of that smoky quality yet again, notable stone fruit brightness on this day with a bit of a soft chocolate and darker honey characteristic to the cup yet again. Been pretty consistent. These things are becoming a little bit more pronounced with time as well. So a nice day, though a little bit more of a preference to the other brew method. Day 30, back through the Chemex, and once again, I feel like I've hit a point of consistency with this cup with a very minor adjustment, as there's more of that soft chocolate, more of the honey characteristic, and some soft complementary citric and stone fruit aspects. This coffee felt like it had a pretty moderate ceiling. It is a honey processed Costa Rican coffee, so I didn't necessarily expect this to be a game changer, a world changer. But with that being said, it was pretty solid for what it was, especially with some of the earlier experiences, as that consistency I'd found and the kind of ease of this cup made it kind of comforting in a sense, just kind of easy to work with. Day 32, more consistency to the cup yet again, as there's that soft chocolate characteristic, the honey aspect on the forefront yet again. Those two things have been present throughout, and they're very much present right at the forefront of this cup. Subtle secondary characteristics, including that fruit on the back end. Little has changed. It's possibly on the decline at this point, though it's been solid again. Day 35, extremely similar notes yet again, as there's a bit more of this apricot-like fruit brightness as opposed to the chocolates today, though both are still very much prominent and present within this cup. Still feels like it's slightly on the decline here on day 38. I can definitely say that again. There's been a little bit of a change, but I feel like the coffee has already seen the best of it, and even then I feel like I was able to kind of experience what this coffee did offer. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have several level 4s. So we will start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, and even though this is a yellow honey processed Costa Rican coffee, I think a lot of people know that these honey processed Costa Rican coffees oftentimes can act a lot like washed coffees. And given that this one did offer a fair bit more clarity than some of the natural processed coffees that still have a slight bit of fermentiness, funkiness to it, this one didn't really have that much of it. I will say that it is on the lower side of level 4, but I feel like it would have been harsh to bump it down any more than that. So level 4 felt perfect for this one, if maybe that's a little generous. Same thing with the finish, level 4. It's not necessarily the longest lasting finish to a coffee, though it does have some of those ever so slight fruit components, fruit characteristics to it. So I could see that there. And then the sweetness, level 4, that's also rounding out a handful of level 4s that may not be true level 4s, as it was a slightly sweeter than expected coffee, especially going into it and especially after that first experience. I think it is, once again, on the lower side of the level 4, though there was a fair bit more sweetness than I might have expected going into it. Florality, level 4. This one right here is a true level 4, as one of the first things I mentioned was that floral honey component to this one that was present and one of the most defining dominant characteristics throughout the time drinking this coffee, so I feel like that level 4 is justified. Stone fruit, level 4. Once again, perhaps on the slightly lower side of the level 4. I feel like this coffee had a somewhat delicate, somewhat tame base to it a lot of the time, and as a result, what factors were present within it stood out maybe a little bit more. The stone fruit being another one of them. As mentioned, it's a slight bit more of a jammy as opposed to fresh fruit stone fruit, which leads me to align it a little bit more with an apricot as opposed to something like a peach. Even then, it was something that I was experiencing a lot throughout this coffee. And we have a bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the savoriness, level 3, and it's not something that I've mentioned too much throughout this review. I feel like there is a slight savory quality that is present within this one throughout the entirety of it. Once again, probably a little high on that level 3, but it was present enough to justify that mark. Body, level 3. I feel like a lot of that can be attributed to what this coffee is. Yet again, we have a honey processed Costa Rican coffee, which the origin and processing method would kind of lead you to believing that it would have a fair bit more body. Even with the Chemex, it still felt like it had a little bit more texture, so I feel like a medium body level 3 felt right for that. Acidity, level 3. Yes, that's something I've mentioned, is that there is a little bit of brightness. I experienced that pretty early in this cup. Even then, it's not quite to the same extent of some of the lighter profiled coffees we've had. I feel like a lot of that is attributed to the roast profile within this coffee, so level 3 felt really good for that. And we have some fruit components, berry fruit, level 3. Yes, that's another thing that I haven't discussed too much. There is a slight Costa Rican kind of berry quality to this cup that was present in maybe subtle manners throughout the entirety of this coffee. Once again, that's probably generous. It's probably on the lower side of level 3. Same thing with the citrus fruit, though. It's something that I've mentioned a lot more throughout this review, so maybe a little bit more pronounced than that berry fruit, but neither of those very strong, very defining characteristics. A lot of the other things I've mentioned and focused on felt a little bit more prominent to me. Chocolate, level 3. Probably last thing really worth discussing in this tasting wheel. I mentioned that one also pretty early on, and I think when I made this tasting wheel, the coffee was slightly on the decline, so while that chocolate at times was maybe a little bit more pronounced, maybe a little bit more on the forefront of this cup, towards the end, I feel like the other things that I mentioned, most specifically that stone fruit and florality, were more pronounced within this coffee, so while it's still present, it's not necessarily as high as some of the other marks. But for the most part, I think this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. I don't think that there's anything else worth discussing or any sort of adjustments I would make to this tasting wheel. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I kind of mentioned it while going through the notes that this coffee felt like it had a somewhat moderate ceiling. Like this coffee was kind of the best it was going to be. I feel like I got a really good representation of what this coffee could be. And it was never going to be something that like set the world on fire, never something that was going to like blow my mind. But even then, it still did a pretty fair and solid job for what I was expecting, especially from some somewhat okay first impressions of this one. In addition to that, I did want to say that the next coffee that we are going to be reviewing from Blossom, I actually liked a fair bit better more than I liked this one, and that's why I'm saving that one for second, so stay tuned for that coffee. But this one right here, it was fine, especially given previous experiences with English coffee. Not necessarily the biggest fan of English coffee roasters in general. I feel like this one was above average from a lot of those other previous experiences, so I think in that sense, this one was solid, if not spectacular. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like a lot of people would actually really enjoy this one because it was very easy to brew. It didn't have too much brightness. It still offered a fair bit of sweetness, and it still offered some, I don't want to say complexity, but it offered depth. So it offered a number of different things, of course, specifically thinking of that florality, that fruit components to it, that chocolate. So it's reminiscent very much of, we'll say, a slightly more developed Central American coffee. It has a lot of those characteristics with some subtle fruit, not too much brightness, and just overall a pretty easy cup to work with, pretty easy coffee to, kind of go through, and pretty easy coffee to finish overall. And I think that's just kind of the best way I can point somebody towards for this coffee, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Blossom, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Delfin Yellow Honey Processed Costa Rica from Blossom Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.